Welcome back to the Resolution Room. Today, I want to talk specifically to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, founders, and anybody managing employees who have ever said, we're probably too small to need HR, because I hear that a lot. And usually, what people actually mean is, we haven't had a big enough HR problem yet. And those are two very different things. A lot of businesses don't think about HR until something has already gone wrong. An employee makes a complaint. Somebody asks for medical leave. A manager wants to fire somebody. A former employee files for unemployment. Payroll discovers somebody has been classified incorrectly. An employee says they haven't been paid properly. Someone alleges discrimination or retaliation. And suddenly, HR becomes very important. The problem is, by that point, I'm no longer helping you prevent the problem. I'm helping you manage the damage. And that can become expensive very quickly. So today, I want to talk through 7 HR problems I consistently see businesses underestimate. Not because I want to scare anybody, but because good HR is actually about reducing risk, strengthening your managers, improving your workplace, and helping you make better business decisions before there's a crisis. Let's get into it. You don't actually have HR, you have someone doing HR tasks. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions I see. A company will tell me, we have HR. And then I ask, well, who handles it? And the answer is our office manager, or our payroll person, or the executive assistant. And sometimes the owner handles it. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those people helping with administrative HR functions. But processing paperwork is not the same as managing human resources. HR is not just onboarding somebody. It isn't just posting a job. It isn't just running payroll. Real HR includes employee relations, compliance, leave administration, accommodations, investigations, performance management, compensation, policy development, workforce planning, terminations, documentation, training, and risk management. And here's where businesses get into trouble. You can successfully process an employee's onboarding paperwork and still mishandle their employment relationship. You can pay someone every 2 weeks and still have wage and hour exposure. You can have an employee handbook and still have managers doing things completely inconsistent with the handbook. That's why one of the first things I look at when working with an organization is who is actually making your people decisions? And more importantly, are they qualified to make them? Your managers are creating HR problems without realizing it. Here's something every business owner needs to understand. Your biggest HR risk may not be your employees, it's your managers. And I don't mean that negatively. Most managers have simply never been trained to manage people. They were promoted because they were good at the job. They were your best salesperson, your best clinician, your best technician, your most reliable employee. And one day you said, congratulations, you're a supervisor. And somehow we expect them to immediately understand performance management, coaching, employee complaints, documentation, leave laws, reasonable accommodations, confidentiality, discipline, and employment risk. That's a lot. And one poorly worded sentence from a manager can create a much bigger problem. Imagine an employee says, I think I need some time off because of a medical condition. And the supervisor responds, well, we really can't afford for you to miss any more work. That manager may simply be thinking about staffing, but depending on the situation, that conversation can become much more complicated. Or an employee makes a complaint and the supervisor says, if you're unhappy here, maybe this isn't the right job for you. Again, the supervisor may think they're having a normal conversation. HR hears something completely different. This is why manager training is not optional once your business starts growing. Your managers are agents of your organization. What they say matters. What they document matters. What they ignore matters. And what they promise employees matters the most. Your documentation is probably not as strong as you think. This one comes up constantly. A manager calls and says, I want to terminate this employee. Okay, why? Well, They've been having performance problems for months. Great. Show me the documentation. And suddenly the conversation gets very quiet. Well, we talked to them several times. Okay. When? I don't remember exactly. Well, what was discussed? We told them they needed to improve. What specifically needed to improve? Well, and now we have a problem because there is what everybody internally knows what happened. And then there's what you can actually demonstrate happened. Those aren't always the same thing. Good documentation doesn't mean creating a 12-page memo every time an employee makes a mistake. It means creating a clear record. What happened? What expectation wasn't met? What conversation occurred? What does the employee need to do differently? What happens if it continues? And was the organization consistent? Because once there is a dispute, memory becomes unreliable very quickly. The employee remembers one version, the manager remembers another. And suddenly, everyone wishes that things were written down. You're waiting too long to address performance problems. This costs businesses more than people realize. Poor performance doesn't usually become expensive overnight. It becomes expensive slowly. A manager avoids addressing an employee because they don't want conflict. The employee continues underperforming. Other employees begin picking up the slack. Your stronger employees notice. Then they become frustrated. Productivity decreases. Morale decreases. Sometimes your best employee leaves. Now you're recruiting again. That's a very expensive chain reaction that may have started with one uncomfortable conversation somebody didn't want to have. There's also another side of this. Businesses sometimes wait 6 months to address an issue and then suddenly decide we need to terminate today. And from an HR perspective, I have to ask, what changed today? If this performance was unacceptable for 6 months, why did we tolerate it for 6 months? This is why effective performance management is proactive. You set expectations. You coach. You document. You follow up. And when improvement doesn't occur, you escalate appropriately. HR should not be the emergency room for management problems. We should be helping build a healthier system before the emergency happens. Your employee handbook may be giving you false confidence. I love employee handbooks. I also think businesses sometimes give them way too much credit. A handbook sitting in someone's email inbox does not automatically protect your business. The question is, do your actual practices match your policies? Your handbook may say employees receive corrective action progressively, but do your managers actually follow that process? Your handbook may explain your complaint procedure. Do employees know where to go? Your handbook may prohibit retaliation. Do your managers understand what retaliation can look like? Your handbook may include leave policies, but who actually administers leave requests? Policies matter, but policies without implementation are just documents. And outdated policies can create another problem entirely. Employment law, change. Your organization, change. Your workforce, change. This is all change. If your employee handbook hasn't been reviewed in years, don't automatically assume it's still protecting you. It may actually contain obligations or practices your organization isn't even following anymore. You're making employment decisions based on what feels fair instead of what is consistent. This is probably one of the most important concepts in human resources. Fairness and consistency are related, but they aren't always the same thing. Business owners sometimes make decisions based on individual circumstances. And I understand why. We're human beings. One employee has been with you for 10 years. Another has been there for 10 months. One employee has always performed well. Another employee has repeated problems. Context matters. But here's where HR comes in. We have to ask, how have we handled similar situations before? Are we treating employees differently for legitimate business reasons? And can we explain that difference? Would our decision still make sense if somebody outside the organization reviewed it? That's a question I think leaders should ask way more often. Not, can I do this? But if somebody challenged this decision 6 months from now, could I clearly explain why we did it? That is a much better HR question. You don't know what you don't know. And this is a category that worries me the most. The HR issue that costs your business money often isn't the issue you're worried about. It's the one you didn't know existed. Maybe you classify somebody as an independent contractor who should really be an employee. Maybe your exempt employees don't actually meet the duties test. Maybe your hiring process asks questions it shouldn't. Maybe your accommodation process isn't documented. Maybe your payroll practices have developed inconsistencies over time. Maybe employees don't know how to report concerns. Maybe supervisors aren't documenting performance. Maybe your company has grown from 10 employees to 40 employees and your HR infrastructure never grew with it. Growth changes your HR obligations. And sometimes very successful companies are operating with HR systems designed for a much smaller organization. That's why I encourage business owners to stop looking at HR as something you purchase only when something goes wrong. Think about HR the same way you think about accounting. You don't wait until you're being audited to start keeping financial records. You shouldn't wait until you're being sued to start thinking about employment practices. So, what good HR consulting should actually do? This is where I think businesses sometimes misunderstand what an HR consultant should provide. You shouldn't be paying somebody just to tell you what the law says. Google can tell you what the law says. AI can probably give you a decent starting point. The value is understanding how that law applies to your actual organization, your employees, your policies, your managers, your business model, your risk tolerance, your culture, your goals. Sometimes a CEO asks me, can we do this? And my response might be, yes, but I wouldn't recommend doing it that way. That's the difference between information and consultation. A good HR consultant isn't there simply to say yes or no. They're there to help you understand the risk, your options, and the best path forward. So, what I would look at in your business, if I were sitting down, I would say for an HR risk review, there are several things I'd want to understand. Who handles HR? How many employees do you have? How are employees classified? How are managers trained? What happens when an employee complains? How do you administer leave? How do you address accommodation requests? How do you document discipline? When was your handbook last reviewed? How do you determine compensation? How do you handle employee separations? Do you have job descriptions? Are they signed? Do those job descriptions actually reflect the work people are performing? And one of my favorite questions, what HR issue keeps you up at night? Because that answer usually tells me a lot. But then I'm also going to look for the issues you aren't worried about yet, because that's part of the value in having a consultant. You may not need a full-time HR director. And here's the good news. You're a small business. I'm not automatically going to tell you to go hire a six-figure HR executive tomorrow. You may not need that, but you may need access to experienced HR guidance. There's a big difference. You may need somebody who can review your policies, train your managers, help you navigate employee relations, audit your HR practices, help with a difficult termination, or even build on your performance management process. And even simply be available when something happens and you don't know what the right next step is. That's where HR consulting can make sense. You're accessing HR expertise without necessarily adding another full-time executive position to your payroll. And for a growing business, that can be extremely valuable. And whenever we're talking about consulting, eventually somebody asks, how much does HR support cost? And that's a fair question. But I think there's another question you should ask. What is poor HR already costing you? How much does turnover cost? How much does it cost when managers spend hours dealing with avoidable employee conflict? How much is recruiting the same position over and over and over cost? What does an unemployment claim cost? And what does poor morale cost? What does one bad termination cost? What does one wage complaint cost? What does one preventable lawsuit cost? And not everything has to become a lawsuit to be expensive. Sometimes Poor HR is like a death by 1,000 cuts. Turnover, absenteeism, poor hiring decisions, manager frustration, employee disengagement, inconsistent practices. These costs add up. So, if you're listening to this and thinking, all right, maybe I do have a few of these issues, that's normal. Most businesses do. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is knowing where your risks are and having a plan to address them. And that's exactly the type of work I do. I help businesses evaluate their HR practices, strengthen their people systems, manage employee relations, reduce risk, and give leaders practical HR guidance when they need it. Not a corporate HR theater, not policies just for the sake of having policies. Practical HR that helps you run your business. If you own a business, lead a nonprofit, or manage a growing organization, and you're not completely confident in your HR infrastructure, this is probably a good time to take a closer look. Start before the complaint. Start before the termination. Start before the employee issue becomes an expensive legal issue, because the HR problem is usually the one we prevented. I'm Robert Holmes, and this is the Resolution Room. If this episode was helpful, share it with another business owner or leader who may need to hear it. And if your organization needs HR support, visit my website and take a look at the services I offer. Because you don't necessarily need a huge HR department, but you need good HR advice. I'll see you next time in the Resolution Room.